Thank you very much, Ranking Member. And at this time, I'm going to introduce our first witness, who's Congressman Jerry Connolly from Virginia. In addition to being sponsor of H.R. 1812, the Small Business Growth Act, Congressman Connolly is the ranking member on the Subcommittee for Technology, Information Policy, and Intergovernmental Relations and Procurement Reform on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. He also serves as co-chair of the Smart Contracting Caucus. Welcome, and look forward to hearing your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having me here today. Ranking Member Velasquez and members of the committee, I really appreciate being here. I have a prepared statement, and I'm not going to read it to you. So I'll submit it for the record. I listened carefully to the opening statements, particularly of Ms. Velasquez, and I looked at some of the testimony you're going to hear from. And let me just say that some of the fears expressed are understandable, but I think if you look at the respective bills Mr. Rogers and I have introduced, they are limited pilot programs, and they keep the small business set-aside entirely intact. You're going to hear testimony apparently from the Women's Chamber of Commerce. It is their testimony, their assertions are absolutely false. My legislation does not in any way change the size standards of the existing program, and in fact explicitly has a provision that this pilot program at GSA for mid-tier companies to see if it works cannot take away any business that otherwise would go to a qualified set-aside small business, period. I want to make that very clear from the outset. I also want to talk about why I introduced this bill, and I assume Mr. Rogers has a similar experience. His bill is limited to DOD. My bill is limited to GSA. I had a number of small businesses, minority-owned businesses in my district come to me, and they have been successful. So they're graduating from the small business status, and the problem is that we set them into federal contracting limbo on the next day. And so they now find themselves still relatively modest in size, albeit successful, in part because of the programs this committee has helped create and foster and needs to do more of, as Ms. Velasquez says. But now you've got a minority-owned business, successful in that category, that has to compete with the big guys. And what's very interesting is they don't get any help. They're now graduated on day one. And frankly, many of them find themselves in an impossible situation because they're competing against multi-billion-dollar entities who have all the resources in the world to do red teams, to put together professional proposal writing, to make sure they're scouring for opportunities in the Federal Register and the like. And what happens to these midterm companies? Often they get just bought up or they go out of business. And so all your hard work in fostering and encouraging correctly opportunities, diverse opportunities in America for smaller businesses, especially minority, female, and veterans-owned businesses, sometimes gets blown away the minute they graduate because there's nothing for them in terms of transition. And so my minority-owned federal contractors who have been part of the small business set-aside came and said, can't you try to address this? We're not asking for permanent help, but, gee, to become a, say, $30 million business, and now we're expected to compete with a $20 billion business, little wonder that your CSIS study shows. If you look at the bar graph that they had in their study for this committee, the big guys are crowding out everybody else. They're getting bigger. The small business set-aside companies are sort of holding their own in that bar graph. There may be a little improvement up and down a little bit, but holding their own. It's the mid-tier category that's actually shrinking, which the federal government doesn't keep accurate data on mid-tier companies, so it's a little hard to provide a lot of empirical data. But anecdotally, I can tell you, at least in my district, and I represent a lot of federal contractors, this is an increasing source of concern. So that was the genesis of the program. I took into account the concerns legitimately raised by Ms. Velasquez and others. I read the committee memo, and I thought it was a very thoughtful memo by staff that there are still some issues that we want to work with you in terms of what definition of midsize. I kind of looked at it from an IT perspective and kept the definition at the employee number size because I'm only dealing with GSA and I'm largely dealing with IT contracts. But I understand, as the staff points out in their memo to this committee, well, there's a lot of diversity and there are a lot of different definitions. And I do actually take into account the staff's concern about one size fits all. We can't do that. I understand that. You can't do it in the small business set aside either. There's a multiplicity of federal agencies with lots of different realities in federal agencies. But my plea to this committee is, can't we, on a very limited basis, create a pilot to see if we can do some good and that preserves and enhances the minority-owned companies you've worked so hard to incubate and foster, as opposed to just setting them out in a Darwinian world where they're, on day one, expected to compete with big guys who have mega resources with which, frankly, they cannot compete. And I believe that's, if we could do that and succeed in that goal, it's a good deal for taxpayers. It will foster innovation, because a lot of times, especially with the smaller contracts, it's the smaller innovative companies that actually are the creative ones who are providing new solutions. And I think it would be win-win in terms of fostering and enhancing the legitimate goals of this committee to create small, minority-owned, female-owned, veteran and disabled veteran-owned businesses as part of the fabric of American contracting. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to entertain any questions.